Part 1. The Grand Assembly Hall stretched so far that Jake Morrison could barely see the other end, through the shimmering holographic displays floating in the air between the rows of seats, and the ceiling was lost somewhere above them in artificial clouds that swirled with purple and blue light whenever someone spoke loud enough, and Jake thought it looked like something out of a dream. Except dreams didn't usually involve this many aliens who all seemed to think humans were about as important as furniture. And he adjusted his gray uniform one more time before glancing at Sophie Blake, who sat next to him with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, because they both knew exactly what their seating assignment meant, and it wasn't good. The human delegation had been given seats in the very last row of the Galactic Council chamber, and not just the last row, but behind a massive support pillar that blocked their view of half the room, and Sophie had complained about it when they first arrived 3 months ago, but Jake had told her to let it go because getting angry wouldn't change anything. And besides, they were here to learn and observe and figure out how this whole galactic politics thing actually worked. And so far, what they had learned was that nobody took humans seriously, and nobody cared what they thought, and nobody even remembered. They were in the room most of the time, down on the main floor where all the important species sat in their fancy chairs, with their names displayed in holographic letters above their heads. Ambassador Kreeth of the Valtorian Empire was giving another speech about taxation and trade, routes and military contributions, and his forearms waved around dramatically, while his voice boomed through the translation devices that everyone wore in their ears, and Jake was taking notes on his datapad, even though he knew none of this would affect Earth because Earth was too small and too new and too irrelevant to matter in these discussions. Sophie leaned over and whispered that she couldn't believe they had to sit through another 4-hour session, where nobody would even acknowledge they existed. And Jake whispered back that at least they were in the room, and that was more than most species got when they first joined the council, and she made a face that said she thought that was a pretty low bar to celebrate. But she didn't argue because they both knew he was right, and they both knew that arguing about it wouldn't change. The fact that humanity had only joined the Galactic Council 5 years ago, after finally developing faster than light travel, and in galactic terms, 5 years, was basically yesterday, and nobody trusted the new kids, especially when the new kids didn't have impressive weapons or vast fleets or ancient wisdom to offer. Ambassador Kreeth finished his speech by saying something about how species that couldn't contribute militarily should contribute economically, and then he added with what passed for a smile on his alien face that of course the humans would be exempt from the new taxes because it would be cruel to tax them into extinction before they had a chance to prove themselves useful, and the entire chamber erupted in laughter, and Jake felt Sophie tense beside him, but he put a hand on her arm and shook his head slightly because this wasn't the time or place to make a scene. A group of Draxian delegates in the front row turned around to look at the humans, and one of them said something to his companion that didn't come through the translators clearly. But both aliens laughed while staring directly at Jake and Sophie, and Jake kept his expression neutral and continued taking notes as if he hadn't noticed, and Sophie later told him she didn't know how he stayed so calm when she wanted to march down there and punch someone in whatever they used for a face. The meeting dragged on with proposal after proposal being debated and voted on and passed without any input from humanity, because nobody asked for human input and nobody cared about human opinions. And Jake recorded everything anyway because that was his job and because he believed that information was power. And the more they learned about how the council operated, the better prepared they would be when humanity's moment finally came. And he had no doubt that moment would come eventually, because humans were nothing if not persistent. When the session finally ended after what felt like 6 hours but was actually only 4, Ambassador Kreeth announced that the council would reconvene next cycle and that the strong would continue to prosper, and that the weak would find their place in service to the greater galaxy, and more laughter echoed through the chamber as delegates began filing out, and Jake and Sophie stayed seated because they had learned early on that trying to leave at the same time as everyone else was a good way to get trampled by beings who were 3 times their size and didn't bother watching where they walked. Sophie said she didn't understand how Jake could just sit there and take it session after session, and he told her that getting angry was easy, but staying patient and learning everything they could about their enemies was hard, and she asked him when exactly the other council members had become enemies, and he said they became enemies the moment they decided humans weren't worth protecting or respecting, and that humanity needed to be ready for the day when words and patience wouldn't be enough. They made their way out through the nearly empty corridor and headed back toward their assigned quarters, which were small and plain compared to the luxury suites given to the major powers. But at least they had privacy and a secure communication system to send reports back to Earth, and Jake was already composing his daily summary in his head about trade proposals and military discussions and the continued pattern of dismissive treatment toward smaller council members. A Valtorian officer caught up with them in the hallway and informed them that Ambassador Kreith was hosting a private gathering that evening and that the human delegation was invited, and Sophie started to refuse, but Jake accepted immediately, because he wanted to observe the major powers in an informal setting where they might speak more freely and reveal information they wouldn't share in official sessions. Sophie waited until they were alone to tell him it was obviously a trap, and another opportunity for the aliens to parade humans around like trained animals, and Jake agreed it probably was exactly that, but he said it was also an opportunity to listen and learn and gather intelligence, and she asked him what kind of intelligence he expected to gather from a cocktail party, and he smiled and said the kind that people reveal when they've had too much to drink and think nobody important is listening. They spent the afternoon preparing and reviewing notes and sending encrypted reports back to Earth Command through the quantum communication array that allowed instant messaging across any distance, and Jake sometimes wondered what the people back home thought when they read his reports about humanity being mocked and dismissed and treated like children. But he also knew that Earth Command understood the long game they were playing. That evening they dressed in their formal uniforms and made their way to the location the Valtorian had specified, and the doors opened automatically to reveal a large room filled with representatives from dozens of different species and servers, moving through the crowd with trays of drinks and food tailored to different biochemistries and soft music, playing from hidden speakers, and Ambassador Kreith spotted them immediately and came forward with his diplomatic smile firmly in place. Kreith welcomed them and told them not to be shy, and several conversations stopped as various aliens turned to look at the humans, and Jake felt the weight of their attention and the mixture of curiosity and condescension in those alien eyes, but he kept his expression pleasant and neutral and thanked the ambassador for the invitation. They spent the next hour circulating through the gathering and engaging in polite small talk that rarely went beyond surface pleasantries, and most species were cordial enough, but there was an undercurrent to every conversation that reminded them they were tolerated here rather than truly accepted. And Jake found himself talking with 3 military officers from different civilizations who were discussing recent conflicts on the frontier. One of them said that the real problem was that too many species wanted a seat at the table without having earned it, and that military strength was what mattered in the end. And another agreed and mentioned humans specifically as an example of a species with nothing to offer except a handful of primitive colony worlds and warships that would be outclassed by their training vessels. And the third officer turned to Jake and said, "No offense intended, of course." Jake said none taken, and that they were absolutely right that humanity had a lot to learn. And the officer seemed surprised by his mature attitude and said most species in humanity's position would be posturing and trying to convince everyone of their hidden strengths, and Jake smiled and said posturing seemed like a waste of time and that they knew where they stood. He watched as the 3 officers exchanged glances and essentially dismissed humanity as any kind of threat or rival, which was exactly what he wanted, and Sophie later asked him how he could just stand there and agree with them when they were insulting his entire species, and he told her that the best way to win a fight was to make your opponent think there was no fight to win. As the evening wore on, and the drinks flowed more freely, the conversations grew louder and the diplomatic courtesy began to slip away, revealing genuine attitudes beneath, and Jake and Sophie positioned themselves near a corner where they appeared to be checking their data pads, but were actually recording everything through their neural interfaces. People nearby were talking about how funny the humans had looked during the council session, and how they were like scolded children. And someone said they almost felt sorry for humans because they had no idea how far out of their depth they really were. And another voice said to give them another decade, and they would probably withdraw from the council entirely because most species weren't cut out for galactic politics. Ambassador Kreith had apparently been drinking heavily and was holding court near the center of the room, talking about how humans were a perfect example of why the council needed to maintain its standards because they were clever enough to develop faster than light travel, but that was where their capabilities ended, and yet they expected to be treated as equals, and someone asked if maybe humans had some hidden advantage, and everyone laughed because the idea was absurd. Jake checked the time and caught Sophie's attention, and they approached Ambassador Creeth to thank him for the invitation and say they needed to return to their quarters, and Creeth waved them away magnanimously and said he was glad they could attend because it was important that they understood how things worked in the council and the hierarchy and the order of things. Once they were alone in the corridor, Sophie said she had wanted to punch all of them, and Jake said he knew, but that wasn't how they would win this, and she demanded to know how exactly they were supposed to win when it felt like they were just taking abuse day after day, and Jake stopped walking and turned to face her with something cold and dangerous flickering in his eyes. He told her they would win by being patient and by letting the other species underestimate them, and by making them believe humans were exactly what they appeared to be, which was weak and insignificant, and no threat at all. And Sophie asked why, and what was the point, and Jake leaned closer and said there were things about humanity and what they had been developing that the council didn't know about, and things they wouldn't know about until the moment humanity chose to reveal them. Sophie stared at him and asked what he was talking about, and he said he couldn't tell her everything yet, but that she should trust him when he said humanity was not as helpless as they appeared, and that when the time came, and when the major powers pushed too far or threatened something, humanity couldn't allow them to threaten. The entire galaxy was going to see exactly what sat behind the quiet humans in the back row. And his voice carried a certainty that made Sophie shiver, even though she didn't fully understand why. She asked how long they would have to endure the mockery and dismissal, and he said as long as it took, but promised it wouldn't be forever. And they resumed walking back to their quarters while behind them, the sounds of the party continued with laughter and boasting from species who thought they had nothing to fear, from the newest and weakest members of their galactic community, and none of them had any idea how wrong they were. 3 months crawled by like years, and every council session felt the same, with humans sitting in the back row behind their pillar, while the major powers made decisions that affected the entire galaxy, without asking for input from species they considered beneath them. And Jake kept taking notes, and Sophie kept getting angrier, and both of them kept sending detailed reports back to Earth Command about everything they saw and heard and learned, because information was the only weapon they had right now, and they were gathering as much of it as possible. Then everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Jake was reviewing supply requisitions in his quarters, and his communicator chirped with an urgent priority code that made his stomach drop, because that code only got used for emergencies, and he tapped it immediately, and Captain Lisa Grant's face appeared on the screen with an expression that told him something bad had happened before she even spoke. Lisa told him they had a situation, and that the survey ship Pathfinder had been attacked by pirates. And Jake asked who, and she said a Draxian raiding clan operating out of the uncharted regions, and that the ship had stumbled into their staging ground while mapping an unclaimed system, and Jake asked about casualties with his heart pounding. 2 dead and 3 wounded, and the ship had taken heavy damage but managed to jump away and was now limping toward Council Station. But it would take 6 hours to arrive, and Jake was already moving and pulling on his uniform jacket and asking if they had contacted the Council. And Lisa said that was exactly why she was calling, because they needed to file a formal complaint and request military assistance immediately. Jake found Sophie in the delegation office and quickly explained what had happened, and together they ran to the Council's Emergency Response Center, which was a smaller chamber used for handling urgent situations between regular sessions, and the Valtorian officer on duty looked surprised to see them but asked how he could help. Jake told him they needed to file a formal incident report and request immediate military response because one of their survey vessels had been attacked by pirates, and the officer's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy, but looked more like pity, and he said that was unfortunate and asked them to transmit the details so the request could be processed. Sophie cut in sharply and asked what he meant by processed, because their people were under attack right now, and they needed ships dispatched immediately, and the officer said he understood their concern, but these matters followed proper procedure, and the report would be reviewed and a threat assessment would be conducted and resources would be allocated accordingly. And his tone suggested he was explaining something obvious to children who should have known better. Jake kept his voice level and asked how long the process typically took, and the officer said for a priority incident it would be 2 to 3 days. And Sophie looked at him like he had just suggested they set themselves on fire because the Pathfinder would be at the station in 6 hours and those pirates could follow them, and the station itself could be threatened. The officer's expression hardened, and he assured them the station was in no danger from a handful of pirates because they had adequate defenses, and he suggested that the Pathfinder proceed to the nearest fortified system if they were concerned about pursuit, and Jake said the nearest fortified system was 12 hours away at their current speed, and they wouldn't make it. The officer said then he suggested they surrender if intercepted because these pirates usually accepted reasonable ransoms, and the casual dismissal of human lives hung in the air between them like poison. And Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, but his expression remained completely calm. Jake said he understood, and that they would file the formal report immediately and thank the officer for his time, and then he grabbed Sophie's arm and pulled her out of the response center before she could say something that would make the situation worse, and she was practically shaking with rage as they headed to a secure communication room. Sophie demanded to know if that was really it, and if they were just going to let their people die, and Jake was already working the communication console with flying fingers, and he said that was the Council's response, but not humanity's response. And Sophie asked what he was doing, and he said he was initiating Protocol 7. Sophie froze because Protocol 7 was buried deep in their briefing documents and was a contingency plan that required special authorization, and she had read about it, but never expected it would actually be used. And she asked if he was sure, because once they started this there would be no going back. Jake said their people were in danger, and the Council wouldn't protect them, so humanity would protect them itself. And he entered a series of encrypted codes and spoke clearly into the recorder, saying he was requesting immediate implementation of Protocol 7, and that they had a hostile situation with casualties and the Council had declined assistance, and he gave his authorization code and sent the message through the quantum channel marked with the highest priority flags. The response came back in less than 10 minutes, which told Jake that Earth Command had been waiting for something like this, and maybe even expecting it, and Captain Grant's face appeared on the screen. But behind her, Jake could see Admiral Stephen Cross, who was the senior military commander for all human forces, and the Admiral stepped forward. Admiral Cross said Jake's request for Protocol 7 was approved, and that Asset Romeo was being activated, and would reach their location in approximately 4 hours, and that Jake was authorized to use all necessary measures to protect human personnel. And Jake felt his pulse quicken and said he understood and asked what they should tell the Council. The Admiral said nothing for now and that they should let things play out and see what happened, but he wanted Jake to understand that what happened next was going to change everything, and the galaxy was about to see what humanity had really been building, and he asked if Jake was ready for that, and Jake said, "Yes, sir." Sophie was staring at Jake with wide eyes and asking what Asset Romeo was, and Jake turned to face her, and she saw that cold certainty in his eyes again. And he said it was the thing that sat behind the quiet humans, and the reason they had been content to sit in the back row and take mockery and abuse. Before Sophie could ask more questions, another alert chimed and the Pathfinder was sending an update, and Captain Ryan Webb's face appeared on screen with blood streaking down one side from a wound above his eyebrow, and behind him, damaged consoles. Sparked and crew members worked frantically to keep systems online. Ryan said they had problems because the pirates had followed them through the jump, and there were 6 ships all heavily armed, and they were demanding the Pathfinder heave to and prepare to be boarded, and Jake asked how long until they were overtaken, and Ryan said 20 minutes, maybe less, because they were venting plasma and had lost 2 of their 3 engines and couldn't fight. Jake told Ryan to listen carefully because help was coming, but he needed to buy as much time as possible and to evade and run and do whatever he had to do. But don't let them board for the next 4 hours. And Ryan looked despairing and said he didn't think they could last 4 minutes if the pirates decided to open fire. Jake said Ryan was going to have to try, and then added that when help arrived he should get his people clear because things were going to get messy. And Ryan asked what kind of help they were talking about, and Jake said the kind the Council didn't know humanity had, and ended the transmission. Jake told Sophie they needed to get to the observation deck, and they made their way through the station, passing clusters of aliens going about their daily business, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening, and why would they be concerned? Because some human ship was in trouble and that wasn't their problem. The observation deck was nearly empty, and Jake and Sophie positioned themselves at a console that gave them a view of local space traffic, and Jake pointed to a cluster of icons showing the Pathfinder and 6 pursuing craft. And they watched as The chase unfolded in real time with the survey ship doing its best to jink and weave. But the pirates were professionals coordinating their approach to cut off escape routes. Sophie noticed that a crowd was gathering because other species had seen the human delegates staring intently at the display and had come to see what was interesting, and among them she spotted several Draxian military officers, including the commander who had dismissed humanity at the party months ago. The commander asked if that was one of their ships and if it was in some kind of trouble, and Jake replied neutrally that pirates had attacked their survey vessel in an unclaimed system, and the commander said that was unfortunate, though his tone suggested he found it more amusing than tragic, and he asked if they had filed a complaint with the council. Jake said they had and that the council was processing their request, and the Draxian said, well, these things took time because of proper procedures and all that, and he turned to his companions and said the humans had lost a ship to pirates, and that it was rather embarrassing for them. More aliens began gathering, drawn by the developing spectacle, and Jake heard whispers and comments about how this proved humanity wasn't ready for space exploration, and how they lacked proper military capabilities, and how perhaps this would teach them to be more careful. On the display, the pirates were closing in, and the Pathfinder was firing its small defensive weapons, but the shots were barely scratching the raiders' shields, and someone in the crowd said they should surrender, because at least then they would survive to be ransomed. And the Draxian commander agreed and said it was over because they were going to be boarded. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 beings now, all watching humanity's humiliation play out on the tactical display, and Jake could feel their judgment and their satisfaction at seeing the upstart species put in their place, and Sophie's hands were clenched into fists, but Jake just stood there calm and patient. Then Sophie gasped and pointed at the display asking what that was, and a new icon had appeared jumping in from faster than light at the edge of sensor range. But it wasn't broadcasting identification codes, and the sensor readings were strange and fluctuating in ways that didn't match any known ship profile. Someone in the crowd suggested it was probably another pirate vessel coming to help claim the prize. But Jake was smiling now with a cold, dangerous smile, and he said quietly that it wasn't another pirate and that it was Asset Romeo, and Sophie looked at him with wide eyes. The unknown ship accelerated, moving at speeds that made several aliens murmur in surprise, because it was fast, much faster than it had any right to be, and it was heading straight for the engagement, and the pirates apparently noticed, because 3 of their ships broke off from pursuing the Pathfinder and moved to intercept. The Draxian commander leaned closer to the display and asked what kind of ship that was, because the profile didn't match anything in their databases, and Jake said simply that it was human, and several heads turned to stare at him. The commander said that was impossible, because they had analyzed humanity's fleet and they didn't have anything that matched that performance profile, and Jake corrected him saying they had analyzed humanity's public fleet and the ships humans let them see, and the commander's expression shifted to something like concern. The unknown vessel reached weapons range of the 3 pirates, and suddenly the display lit up with weapons fire. But it wasn't conventional plasma bolts or laser beams, and instead it was streams of accelerated projectiles moving at relativistic speeds, tearing through space like the wrath of an angry god. The first pirate ship's shields collapsed in less than 2 seconds, and the projectiles punched through its hull like paper-venting atmosphere and bodies into the void, and the ship went dark, tumbling away as a lifeless hulk, and the crowd on the observation deck went completely silent. The second pirate ship tried to run, but the human vessel adjusted course with impossible precision, and more weapons fire lanced out, and another pirate was turned into drifting scrap metal and debris, and the third pirate managed to get off a shot, which was a heavy plasma torpedo that would have crippled most ships, but the human vessel didn't even try to dodge, and the torpedo struck some kind of energy barrier and simply ceased to exist, like it had been absorbed and dispersed into nothing. Someone in the crowd breathed out asking what kind of shields those were, and nobody had an answer, and the third pirate died just as quickly as the first 2, and the remaining 3 pirates who had been closing in on the Pathfinder suddenly reversed course and tried to jump to faster than light speed. But the human vessel accelerated again, moving at speeds that should have been impossible for something its size. It reached the first fleeing pirate and destroyed it before the jump drive could engage, and the second pirate made it into the jump. But the third wasn't fast enough, and was torn apart by railgun fire, and in less than 5 minutes, 6 pirate vessels had been reduced to 4 hulks and 2 escapees, and the human ship called Asset Romeo slowly approached the damaged Pathfinder, with its weapons still active and scanning for additional threats. The observation deck was in absolute chaos, with aliens shouting questions and demanding explanations, and accessing their own databases trying to identify what they had just witnessed. And the Draxian commander was speaking urgently into his communicator, with his expression shocked and his posture rigid. Jake just stood there watching the display with satisfaction, and finally he turned to address the crowd and told them that, for those asking, the vessel was the CNS Defiant commissioned 6 months ago, and she was the first of her class designed and built in the Epsilon Eridani system at facilities they didn't know existed. He continued explaining that her weapons were railguns firing depleted uranium slugs at .07 light speed, and her shields were gravitic barriers that manipulated space-time itself, and she was one of 12 identical ships, currently in service with another 30 under construction. And the silence was absolute now, with every being on the observation deck staring at Jake with expressions ranging from shock to fear. Jake said that humanity joined the council to learn and to understand how things worked in their galaxy. And they had learned a great deal, including that the major powers respected strength and despised weakness, and saw humans as insignificant, children playing at galactic politics, and he gestured at the display where the Defiant was positioning itself to escort the damaged Pathfinder to safety. He told them what they didn't know, and what humanity kept very quiet, was that humans had been preparing for the possibility that the council wouldn't protect them, and that they would need to protect themselves. And while the major powers had been laughing and dismissing them and putting them in the back row, humanity had been building and researching and developing technologies that didn't exist in their databases, because humans invented them independently. Ambassador Kreith came running onto the observation deck with several security officers trailing behind him, and his 4 arms were waving aggressively, and he demanded to know what the meaning of this was, and said that vessel had just destroyed 4 ships in council space without authorization, and that this was an act of aggression. Jake turned to face the Valtorian calmly and said, "Those ships attacked a human vessel without provocation, and killed 2 of their crew and wounded 3 others. And when they requested assistance from the council, they were told it would take 2 to 3 days to process their request, and 2 of their people were dead, because the council decided proper procedure was more important than human lives." The Draxian commander stood and said he would concede that humanity's actions were technically legal, and perhaps even justified given the circumstances, but they must understand the position this put the council in, because if every member species began developing secret military assets, the balance of power became impossible to assess, and how could they maintain peace when they didn't know who had what capabilities? It was a fair question asked without anger or accusations, and Jake appreciated the directness, and he told the commander he understood the concern, but asked him if the balance of power in the council had ever truly been about transparency, or if it had been about might, and he said the Valtorians and Draxians and Hectarians dominated the council, not through honesty but through demonstrated military superiority. Jake said smaller species deferred to them because they feared the consequences of opposition, and humanity entered the council as one of those smaller species, and was dismissed and mocked and relegated to the back row where they wouldn't trouble the real powers, and they were told to be patient and learn their place and accept they had no voice in galactic affairs. He paused and looked around the chamber and said humanity did learn, and they learned that in this galaxy, respect was earned through strength, not through playing by rules that only seemed to apply to the weak. And Kreith said triumphantly that Jake was admitting humanity built these weapons to threaten other council members. Jake said he admitted humanity built these weapons to ensure they could defend themselves because they could not rely on the council to do it, and the Pathfinder incident proved that conclusively. And he wanted to be very clear that humanity had no interest in threatening other council members, and they wanted peaceful coexistence and trade and cultural exchange and all the benefits that council membership promised. He said, but humanity would not be victims and would not sit quietly while their people were killed, because intervention was inconvenient or took too long to process through proper procedures, and Sophie was watching reactions around the chamber, and the mood was shifting because many of the smaller species who had never spoken up in council sessions were nodding slightly. They understood what Jake was saying, because they had felt the same frustrations and the same helplessness in the face of the council's unwritten hierarchies, and a representative from a species Sophie didn't recognize stood hesitantly and said she was Ambassador Lyra of the Selenian Collective, and they were a minor member of the council who had experienced similar difficulties in securing protection for their vessels. Lyra asked if Jake was suggesting that smaller species should also develop hidden military assets, and Jake considered the question carefully and said he could not and would not tell other species what they should do, but he would say the council's current structure favored the strong and ignored the weak. He said if that structure was unwilling to change, then the weak must find ways to protect themselves, whether that meant military development or mutual defense pacts or other solutions. And that was for each species to decide, and Kreith warned that this was dangerous rhetoric and that Jake was encouraging instability and fracturing the unity of the council. Jake replied bluntly that the council's unity had always been a fiction, and it was a hierarchy masked as a democracy where the powerful made decisions and everyone else accepted them or faced consequences, and humanity was simply refusing to accept that arrangement. The Draxian commander asked what humanity wanted and what outcome they were seeking from this session, and Jake took a breath because this was the crucial moment where he would either secure humanity's position or turn the entire council against them. He said they wanted recognition that humanity was a sovereign species, with the same rights and responsibilities as any other council member. And they wanted their voice to carry weight not because they sat quietly in the back, but because they demonstrated they could defend their interests and contribute to galactic security. Jake said they wanted the council to acknowledge that its current protection protocols were insufficient, particularly for newer or smaller member species, and Kreith said scornfully that humanity was asking for a seat at the adults' table, and Jake corrected him, saying they were demanding the respect they had earned. He said humanity proved they could defend themselves, and proved they understood galactic law better than many species who had been there for centuries, and proved they were not the helpless children the major powers thought they were. And the question now was whether the council could adapt to that reality or cling to outdated prejudices. The chamber erupted in arguments with representatives shouting opinions and accusations in dozens of languages, and the translators struggled to keep up with the chaos, and Jake stood at the platform waiting for order to be restored. Eventually, the council president, who was an ancient being from a species that predated most galactic civilizations, raised a crystalline appendage for silence, and the chamber gradually quieted, and the president said in a voice like wind through canyons that Jake had given the council much to consider, and the emergency session would adjourn while they deliberated. Jake bowed slightly and said thank you, and as he and Sophie made their way out of the chamber, they were intercepted by Ambassador Lyra and several other representatives from smaller species, and Lyra said quickly, while glancing around nervously, that what Jake said about smaller species protecting themselves resonated with them. Jake stopped and looked at the group gathered around him, and realized they were scared of the larger powers and scared of the consequences of speaking up, but also desperate for someone to acknowledge their struggles, and he said quietly that he meant every word. Lyra admitted the Selenian Collective didn't have resources to develop weapons like humanity's, and their economy was barely sufficient to maintain their current fleet, and Sophie suggested that perhaps multiple species could pool resources in a mutual defense agreement between several smaller species to provide security, without requiring each to build an entire fleet independently. Another ambassador said the larger powers would never allow it, because they would see it as a threat to their dominance, and Jake said firmly to let them, because the charter didn't prohibit defensive alliances between council members, and if the Valtorians and Draxians could maintain their power block, then smaller species could create their own. Lyra looked at her companions and then back at Jake and asked if humanity would be willing to help facilitate such an alliance, and Jake hesitated, because this was moving beyond his authorization into territory that would require approval from Earth Command, but he could also see the opportunity to reshape galactic politics in humanity's favor. He said carefully that he couldn't speak for his government on that question, but he would communicate their interest to his superiors, and in the meantime, he suggested they begin quiet discussions among themselves to identify which species shared their concerns and what resources they could pool, and what their defensive needs were. Jake said when and if they were ready to formalize something, they could discuss humanity's involvement, and the group nodded, with some looking hopeful for the first time, and they dispersed carefully, not wanting to draw attention to their gathering. Sophie said once they were alone that Jake had just planted seeds of a whole new power block, and Jake replied that someone needed to, because the current system was unstable due to concentrating power too narrowly, and if they could create a counterbalance, the council might actually function the way it was supposed to, Sophie said, or they might start a political revolution that tears the whole thing apart. And Jake acknowledged that was a risk, but doing nothing and letting humanity remain marginalized and powerless was not acceptable either. They returned to their quarters and immediately sent an encrypted report to Earth Command, detailing everything that happened in the session and the conversation with smaller species, and Jake emphasized the strategic opportunity this represented to build a coalition of allies who would support human interests in council politics. The response came back faster than expected, directly from Admiral Cross saying, Jake was authorized to continue preliminary discussions with potential allies, but not to commit humanity to any formal agreements without explicit approval, and they were analyzing political implications, and 6 more ships of the Defiant class were being moved into position around council space. Jake felt a chill at that last statement because 6 more ships would bring humanity's revealed strength to 7 warships each, capable of taking on multiple conventional vessels, and the major powers would be conducting frantic intelligence assessments, trying to determine just how many ships humanity really had. Sophie asked if Jake thought they would try to force a confrontation, and he said they might because pride was a powerful motivator, and humanity had wounded theirs badly, but they were also pragmatic and would want to assess full capabilities before committing to military action. 2 months passed with tension building throughout council space, and Jake met quietly with representatives from 23 different smaller species, all of them expressing interest in some form of mutual defense arrangement, but none wanting to be the first to commit publicly because they feared retaliation from the major powers, who were clearly unhappy about humanity's rising influence. Ed and the weak accepted, and everyone pretended it was democratic. Jake said bluntly that it was a bad arrangement serving only the interests of a few at the expense of many, and the Draxian laughed, saying he actually agreed, though, not to quote him because his government was less enthusiastic about these developments. He said he was there because as a military officer his job was to assess threats and opportunities, and this alliance represented both, and he wanted to see what humanity built. And his assessment was that humanity was far more dangerous than initially calculated, not because of ships, but because of their ability to inspire and organize species the major powers had dismissed as irrelevant. The commander said Jake had weaponized the weak by showing them they didn't have to be weak if they stood together, and Jake said he would take that as a compliment, and the commander said it was meant as one, and as a warning, because the major powers would not sit idle while their control eroded. Over the following months, the alliance grew stronger with regular meetings and joint training exercises, and shared technology development, and the major powers tried various tactics to undermine it through economic pressure and political maneuvering. But the alliance members stood together. Jake and Sophie continued their work on Council Station, no longer sitting forgotten in the back row, but actively participating in debates and building coalitions and pushing for reforms. And the galaxy was indeed becoming more interesting as smaller species found their voices and refused to be silenced. One evening, Jake stood on the observation deck looking out at the stars, and Sophie joined him, asking if he ever imagined things would turn out this way when they first arrived, and Jake said honestly, no, because he expected to spend years being dismissed and mocked before humanity earned any real respect. He said, but the Pathfinder incident forced their hand and they had to reveal their capabilities earlier than planned, which turned out to be fortunate because it inspired the alliance and changed everything. Sophie asked what came next, and Jake said that was the real question because they had disrupted the old order, but building a new one would be harder and require patience and diplomacy and continued strength. He said the major powers would keep testing them and looking for weaknesses, and the alliance would face internal disagreements and external pressures. But if they could weather those challenges, they might actually create something better than what existed before. Sophie smiled and said the quiet humans in the back row had certainly made their mark, and Jake replied they had indeed, and the galaxy would never underestimate humanity again, because now everyone knew what sat behind those quiet humans, and they knew that humans protected their own no matter what it took. And that was a lesson the galaxy needed to learn. The Valtorians and Draxians conducted their own investigation, trying to determine whether humanity posed a genuine military threat or just had a few lucky advanced ships, and Jake was careful to answer honestly where he could, and cite classified information where he couldn't, which kept them uncertain about humanity's true capabilities. Then came the test that Jake had been expecting when 3 Draxian military vessels entered the system, where Earth's colony world of Nova Terra was located, claiming they were conducting a routine navigation exercise, but their presence so close to a human world was clearly meant as intimidation and a message. Captain Grant called Jake immediately and said they were testing humanity to see how they would respond, and Sophie noted the Defiant was 6 hours away, which meant if those ships turned hostile, Nova Terra only had local defense platforms, and Grant said the Draxians knew that and had calculated their timing carefully. Jake studied the tactical data and made his decision quickly, saying they would call the bluff and order Nova Terra's defense platforms to active status and hail the Draxian ships, politely informing them they were conducting their exercise in claimed space without prior notification, which violated council protocols, and requesting they move to unclaimed space. Sophie asked what if they refused, and Jake said then they would escalate. But he didn't think they would, because this was political theater, not a genuine military threat, and they wanted humanity to overreact. And he was right, because the Draxian ships acknowledged the hail and offered perfunctory apologies for the navigational error, and departed within an hour. Grant said they were testing resolve, and humanity showed them they wouldn't be intimidated without escalating unnecessarily. But Jake wasn't feeling triumphant, because he knew they would try something else, and this was just the beginning, and he was right, because over the next week there were incidents at 3 different human colonies. Unexplained sensor contacts vanished when investigated, and merchant vessels reported being shadowed by unidentified ships, and nothing was overtly hostile. But there was a clear pattern of intimidation, and the Council's formal investigation concluded with a mixed verdict, finding humanity acted within the letter of the law, but recommending increased transparency going forward. It was a face-saving compromise that satisfied no one, but prevented any immediate crisis, and then came the invitation that changed everything, when Ambassador Lyra contacted Jake with an urgent request for a meeting, and when he and Sophie arrived. At the designated location, they found not just Lyra, but representatives from 15 different species. Lyra said formally that they had been discussing Jake's suggestion of a mutual defense alliance, and they would like to present a formal proposal, and over the next hour Jake and Sophie reviewed it, finding it more comprehensive than expected, covering not just military cooperation, but economic partnerships and technology sharing and coordinated political action within the Council. Jake said honestly this was ambitious and would terrify the major powers, and Lyra replied they were aware, but they were also aware that if they continued as they had been, they would remain forever at the mercy of species who viewed them as insignificant, and humanity's example showed them that change was possible, and the weak could become strong if they were willing to take risks and support each other. Jake looked at Sophie, who nodded slightly, because they were thinking the same thing, that this was exactly the kind of strategic opportunity Earth Command would want them to pursue, and Jake said he would forward this proposal to his government, and couldn't guarantee they would agree to participate, but it would be seriously considered because this kind of alliance served humanity's interests as much as theirs. Lyra said they would await humanity's response, but she wanted Jake to understand something, which was that whether humanity joined or not, they were moving forward with this because his actions inspired them to stop accepting their subordinate position, and they were grateful for that inspiration but no longer needed permission to act. Jake felt a surge of respect for the small ambassador who had found her courage and with it found her power, and he said he understood, and that for what it was worth, he thought they were doing exactly the right thing. And as they left the meeting, Sophie let out a long breath, saying they were really reshaping galactic politics. Jake corrected her, saying they were trying, and yes, they had set something in motion, but the question now was whether they could control it, or whether it would spiral into something unpredictable, and Sophie asked what he thought would happen. Jake looked out at the stars through a nearby viewport and said he thought the galaxy was about to become a much more interesting place, because the humans in the back row just moved to the center of the stage, and everyone was watching to see what they would do next. 3 weeks later, the formal signing ceremony took place in a venue that would have been unthinkable just months before, which was Earth itself, and Jake stood in the newly constructed diplomatic facility outside Geneva, watching shuttles descend. from orbit carrying representatives from 23 species for what they were calling the Alliance of Free Worlds. Sophie stood beside him in her formal dress uniform, having been promoted to commander after the Pathfinder incident, and she said she still couldn't believe they agreed to hold the ceremony on Earth, and Jake replied they wanted to make a statement. And what bigger statement than gathering on the homeworld of the species that inspired this movement? Admiral Cross approached with President Martin Cole of the United Earth government, and the president thanked Jake personally, saying what he accomplished exceeded their most optimistic projections, and Jake replied, there were moments when he thought, it would all fall apart, but Cole said that was leadership and making decisions when the outcome was uncertain. The ceremony was designed to be broadcast throughout the galaxy, with every major news network covering it, and political implications being debated on countless worlds, and the major powers were watching with expressions ranging from concern to outright anger. The Alliance Chamber was circular, with seats arranged so all members could see each other equally, with no hierarchy, and no front row or back row, which had been humanity's one non-negotiable demand when designing the space. Ambassador Lyra stood at the center podium, saying today marked the beginning of a new era in galactic politics, and that for too long the Council had been dominated by a handful of powerful species who dictated terms to everyone else and spoke of unity while enforcing hierarchy and promised protection while leaving them vulnerable. She said the Alliance of Free Worlds was built on a different principle, which was that all civilizations, regardless of age or military, might deserve equal voice in matters affecting their future, and they were not seeking to replace the Council or declare independence, but demanding the Council live up to its stated ideals of equality and mutual cooperation. One by one, representatives from each member species approached the podium to speak, and the Selenians talked about decades of being ignored when reporting piracy, and the Antarian Confederation spoke of economic policies imposed by larger species that devastated their trade. When it was humanity's turn, President Cole took the podium, and Jake had helped write the speech, but hearing it delivered with Cole's gravitas gave it new weight, and Cole said, humanity came to the stars with hope, believing they would find a community of equals working together, but instead found a hierarchy that valued strength over justice. He said they also found dozens of species who shared their values, but lacked power to assert them. And to those species, humanity said change is always possible, and justice is always worth fighting for. And you are not alone. The chamber erupted in applause from Alliance members, and Jake noticed some human observers were wiping away tears, and the formal signing followed, with each representative placing their mark on the Alliance Charter. When it came time for humanity's signature, President Cole gestured for Jake to join him at the podium, saying, Jake was the first human to show the galaxy they would not be content to sit quietly in the back row, and this alliance existed because he had courage to defend their people when the Council would not. Jake was taken aback because this had not been discussed beforehand, but he moved forward and accepted the ceremonial pen and added his signature to the document that would reshape galactic politics. The ceremony concluded with a reception where delegates mingled, building personal relationships crucial for the Alliance's success, and Jake found himself surrounded by ambassadors wanting to thank him personally. The Draxian commander approached with two companions and extended his hand in the human greeting, saying he wanted to congratulate Jake on a masterful political maneuver, and that when they first met he dismissed humanity as insignificant, which was his error. Jake shook the offered hand and said he hoped this alliance would ultimately strengthen the Council, not weaken it, and the commander said perhaps, though the definition of strengthen might differ depending on who you asked, because the major powers saw this as a challenge to their authority. He said Jake had created a voting bloc that could potentially override their preferences on any given issue, and Jake asked if that wasn't how democracy was supposed to work, with majority rule, and the commander said in theory yes, but in practice, galactic politics had always been about managed consensus where the powerful propose